Hello, we're going to allow 2 minutes for attendees to arrive. We're going to allow another 2 minutes for attendees to arrive. Hi, everyone. I would like to thank you all for attending our first part of the series, Summer Tea with Curators, the Five Senses Intro and Sight. I am Lauren, Membership Engagement and Stewardship Coordinator. The first part of the series is an informal exploration of the five senses through the lens of the museum's collection. Today's speakers are Henriette, Cunningham Center Manager, Assistant Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, and Danielle, Curator of Painting and Sculpture. Before I hand this over to our panelists, I wanted to mention that following the presentation, there will be a Q&A. Feel free to submit a question in the Q&A box located in the upper left of your screen. If you want to go to the second slide, I can show you. Perfect. So that's where the Q&A box is located. And I will now turn it over to Danielle.
Hello. So we wanted this series to engage your senses. So we're starting off with sight. And just in the way of a quick historical overview for the five senses, historically, sight has always been considered the most important. And as we all view art together, even if remotely during this lockdown period, we most often use our facility of sight to experience works of art. So we thought it would be a good place to start. In the history of Western art, this kind of interest in the five senses goes back to Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. But then over time, as sensory experience was studied more scientifically, it became, kind of more codified and more theorized. And we're kicking it off with the 17th century when the study of optics was really very much developed. So during that time, there also were a lot of series of the five senses, as we'll see in Henriette's presentation. So often these were allegorical series in which each of the five senses were explored. And they often comment on behavior or have kind of moralistic implications, as we'll hear from Henriette in just a moment. We also want to stress that different ways of seeing came into play in the 17th century. So we're going to talk about these specific two works, which you see on the screen, the print on the left and the painting on the right, mostly kind of as a secular way of viewing on the left with a northern print, and a more religious way of seeing with the painting from 17th century Naples on the right. And we kind of did this deliberately. We thought these two works spoke well to each other. There are several intersections. They're many differences, but also similarities between them, and we'll explore kind of the juxtaposition of these works together. So with that, I will pass it on to Henriette to discuss the print.
Okay, we can go to the slide after this. Hello, everybody. I thought it would be a wonderful place to start because working with prints all the time and looking into our collection, I found this incredible series of the 5 senses by the French artist and printmaker Abraham Bosch. He was born in 1602 in France, in Tours, and he was a very prolific printmaker. He was very well regarded. He moved from Tours to Paris, where he worked in various print shops, and this particular series I really wanted to highlight because it's just a direct translation of this whole concept of the 5 senses, and they're also visually just wonderful and very rich, lots of detail and lots of things to look at. I wanted to just show you the whole series briefly before I kind of dive into the main print, which is about sight, because it's nice to see them all, and you could always later, when the museum reopens, come and visit us and see them actually in the flesh, which is the way that these types of works should be seen, obviously. So let's start with the first one. This is the print, the sense of hearing, and here we see a lovely interior scene with a family all playing various instruments, and obviously all referring to the sense of hearing. So we can go to the next slide. And then here we have the sense of taste. And so here again, a very affluent family eating a very a lovely meal with artichokes and drinking wine. So all the taste buds are being stimulated. And then in the front, I always love this about these types of prints. You see this little dog lapping up something from a plate, and he's almost on a pedestal. So I love how the focus is on the little dog here. So we can get to the next slide. And here we have also an interior scene. This is a bedroom, obviously, and here's the sense of touch. And the little amorous couple is sitting there, and their hands are all over each other. And then on the side, we see the maid picking up the, like peeking the curtain, and so the bed is being revealed. So obviously, this is the sense of touch. And we'll go to the next one. And here is an exterior view. We have this wonderful gardenscape, and again, a very affluent couple smelling flowers. There's a little boy peeking from behind a flower pot. And then in the front, again, we see dogs, probably hunting dogs because of their keen sense of smell. So everything has to do with sense of smell here. And then we go to the next one. Okay, and now we arrive at the sense of sight. And I wanted to say a little bit about the importance of this particular print, because this print series was so popular that that there were actually paintings done after this print, which is a very unusual thing, because usually prints were done after paintings. And it's interesting because paintings and prints are a very different medium, obviously, and prints were also a more democratic medium. They were accessible for almost anybody because they were inexpensive, and they were a way to kind of disseminate information and propaganda. It was a way for an artist to kind of become more well-known. If he had a beautiful painting that he did, then he wanted maybe a printmaker to create a print after it, and that way he would get more notoriety. And so prints were used for all these different ways. But prints were also great conversation pieces, and this series is such a thing. All the details that are in here can lead to these wonderful conversations. And the way that prints were kept was usually in albums. They were not specifically hung on the wall. They were usually kept in albums, and that's also why a lot of the prints are in a beautiful condition still. And then people would bring them out for special occasions, and then they could discuss whatever was being shown. And so this particular print, The Sense of Sight, we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to show you this because I found this and I think it's wonderful. This is actually the painting after the print. So here was it's an unknown artist who was so impressed with this particular series that he actually created a painting after the print series. And this particular one is done is actually hung in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Tours, which was actually the birthplace of Abraham Bosch. So what is interesting to know about Abraham, and we can go to the next slide, which will show a detail of the print. Abraham came from an interesting family. He was very much a Frenchman. However, his father had been a German immigrant. And being a German immigrant, he also was a Protestant. And so Tours was kind of a hub at the time of the Huguenots, which were the French Protestants who were accepted by they were a minority in France still, because the Catholic Church was really in charge still. But they were accepted, and there was an Edict of Nantes that was created that kind of gave them the way to still engage in their religion. However, that was only for a short period of time, and the Protestants then had to go underground after that edict was revoked. So his Protestantism is interesting because it actually shows us something about the artist that gives us an insight in his way of thinking about the world. And the way that Protestants and Catholics thought about the world around them and how they actually would engage in their religion was very different. And it's actually, there's little subtleties in this print that talk about this particular way of thinking. And like Danielle was saying, the Catholics, usually the sense of sight was the hierarchically the most important, regarded to be the most important one. The Protestants were more engaged with the sense of hearing. And it's interesting to think about that, because when you go into a Catholic church, when you enter, everything is about all the senses, and specifically the sense of sight. It's very sensory overload when you walk into a Catholic church. There are these wonderful sculptures and paintings, and that is really how the Catholics would relate to their Christ and their religion. However, the Protestants felt that they had to simplify things, and all those things were were distractions to what was pure about their religion and was the Word of God. And so they stripped their churches bare, they whitewashed them, and so the hearing became the dominant sense. So here we have kind of his interpretation, Bosch's interpretation on the sense of sight, which is kind of critical, but it also provokes a lot of other things about the fact that there are all these new inventions, and it's his stance, and the Protestant world's stance on these new inventions, like, for instance, which was a relatively new invention, which was the mirror. And this woman here is looking in a mirror, and obviously this type of mirror was still pretty rare and was only usually seen in very wealthy families. And we can go to the next slide, because we can actually see that there is another mirror above her. I'm sorry, my rooster is crowing in the background. But so there's these two mirrors here, and the idea of reflection is all about vanity as well, and also the sense of self, and investigating that kind of sense of self. And so, which is a wonderful kind of way of perception, and the idea of perception. And it also makes us think about how the artist himself was thinking about what his role in all of this is. An artist is constantly reproducing reality, and is that really truly reality, or is it just a copy of reality? Anyway, there's these beautiful philosophical questions that are being posed in the kind of details of this print. So let's go to the next slide. So prints are different as well in that they, like I said before, convey certain messages. And the border of a print, and I think there was a question regarding that, the border of a print can sometimes be interchangeable. And usually it's the main, the center image is the most important part. And then the border oftentimes was changed either by somebody who wanted to have it personalized, or wanted to have it as a gift for somebody, and then the text underneath could change. This particular text, I think, is done by the artist himself. And there are two texts. There's one in Latin and there's one in French, both kind of the reigning languages at the time. And obviously this is a French print as well. The texts are kind of enigmatic. It's something to talk about, something to ponder. It's not a direct kind of political or religious message, but it's talking about a lot of really interesting subjects that were at the top of everybody's conversation at the time. And I wanted to go to the next slide. So here is one of the other details, which is very interesting. It's the only male in the bedroom, and he is looking outward through a thing that looks kind of like a primitive telescope. And it is very interesting in that time, which is around the 1630s that this series was created, that this was the time that Galileo Galilei had just, the astronomer and physicist, had just recently published his book about his heliocentric worldview, and was actually the Catholic Church wanted to do away with him and called it heresy, and he ended up on house arrest for the rest of his life. So this idea of the telescope, of looking outward, is obviously a reference maybe to Galileo, but also in an outward looking and all the new scientific inventions that were happening at the time as well. So that could be a reference to this particular detail. So we'll go to the next one. And here are some lovely details that are referencing vanity. And the fact that vanity is very much in the foreground is also because the Protestant church felt that vanity was one of those vices that could lead to worse things. So you had to keep it in check. So the idea that clothing are a human's vanity, I mean, dressing up, if you're putting on a show, and so that had to be reined in somewhat. And the little cat that's poking in the side was also a symbol of vanity, which is another little detail. And then we can go to the next slide. And I love this detail so much. This is around those borders, you usually had these kind of grotesque figures. And this particular figure is on the center bottom. You can see it later in the bigger print again. But it's actually, the text says it's all about the vision, and the kind of googly-eyed monster wearing spectacles could be Bosch having a kind of a dialogue with this idea of science versus kind of magical thinking. And because the spectacles at that time were still regarded, yes, they were a new invention, relatively new invention, but they were also still kind of considered somewhat magical. They were thinking that if you put spectacles on, you could see the deeper meaning of things. And so this kind of reference is just a wonderful way of Bosch trying to talk about the duality of these things of seeing and not really seeing, and what are you seeing and what are you looking at. So we can then go to the next slide, and that's, so here we have the whole the whole print once again. And all these little details just kind of make for this very interesting story that Bosch is creating. And, you know, at the time, the Protestants had to be careful in how they would convey their religion. And therefore, an enigmatic print was obviously a great way to bring out these types of questions and let people ponder them. And that's what's so wonderful about these prints. And we're still pondering these prints. So they're still having their effect. So now I'll hand it over to Danielle.
Thank you. So moving to a very different way of viewing, very different context, but Henriette really set this up beautifully in terms of all the different ways that people were viewing and the reasons for that at the time. As I mentioned before, the study in optics, the invention of the telescope and spectacles and so forth. This painting by Antonio de Bellis, a Neapolitan painter, a follower of Caravaggio working in Naples from about the 1640s or so, would have hung in a chapel in a church. It's very large. I have to impress upon you that if we were standing in front of it, it's really almost life size. So it's a very different way of viewing. And as Henriette mentioned, in Catholic Europe, seeing was, not just seeing, but looking at religious art or art in general was very different. The Catholic Church used religious art to kind of help people meditate and to really kind of drive home their agenda of keeping people seduced. So there's this kind of action in 17th century Southern European painting. Usually the story is kind of at the apex of action, bright colors, as you can see, there's a lot of dynamism and the use of light, this very dramatic use of light. So all of that plays into how we're seeing and how we're interpreting this work. And of course, the use of extreme naturalism. So I would argue that the style of this painting helps us to kind of be part of the world. So there's this question going back to what Henriette said of the artist and the artist recreating a space for us to either kind of trick us to be part of, or, you know, is it artifice or is it actually an extension of our world? So I think that's what this artist in particular is doing. Just to start with the story, the title, as you can see, is The Liberation of St. Peter. St. Peter was thrown into jail by King Herod for being one of the apostles of Christ. And this is the day before his trial when, as the Acts of the Apostles tells us, an angel comes to him in his prison cell. And as you can see, the angel's grabbing him rather forcibly by his shirt and liberates him. He actually is set free from jail. And so there's this kind of divine intervention. But the thing to keep in mind about the scripture that describes this story is that it's unclear whether St. Peter is having a vision. He's not sure himself if this is happening or if it's, you know, reality. And so the artist and artists who deal with this subject play with that idea. And this all goes back to vision. Is this, you know, visionary? Is it a mystical experience? And we as viewers are asked that same question. Is what we're seeing actually happening before us? Are we participating in this miraculous vision? Or is it just kind of, you know, a representation that we can separate from our reality? Something to also keep in mind about the story is that the two sleeping guards, so there's the whole composition is framed by these two guards, they end up getting killed because St. Peter, or Peter at the time, escapes from prison, and so they didn't do their job. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We'll see this detail. So hopefully you can see both of the guards' eyes are closed. They're not seeing, they're sleeping. In contrast to St. Peter's very widely open eyes, who is seeing. And this is kind of all about the seeing is believing trope. The kind of believers, the true followers of the Christian faith will see the light literally in this painting, while those who do not are blinded in a sense. And so I thought it would be interesting to really think about this painting in terms of the importance of vision, and in this sense, religious vision, and how even if you're having a kind of mystical experience or a religious vision, that is valid in this context. So, the guards' inability to see actually leads to their death. St. Peter, as you can see in this detail, is surprised. He's not kind of expecting to be liberated. He's not expecting an angel to appear to him. There's this play kind of with St. Peter's, belief and disbelief and kind of wondering what's happening that we as viewers might also relate to, as a sense of, we're not sure if we should believe or not. And really the artist's job in this context is to convince us. One of the great theorists of the 17th century, Archbishop of Bologna, Gabriele Paleotti, said that art is intended to delight, to teach, and to move. And so to teach, because the biblical stories are kind of made visual, but to delight and move is really to kind of, as I said, seduce the viewer to really kind of buy into these stories and believe them and reaffirm one's belief, especially when the Protestant church is gaining traction in the 17th century and the Catholic Church has to kind of fight back in a sense, and it does so very much through art. Next slide, please. So just to kind of wrap this up, we in turn, as viewers of the painting, are asked to kind of question the scene and whether it's happening before us or whether it's, as I said, just a kind of, artistic construction. The kind of warning here is the guards. Remember, if you don't believe, that could have some dire consequences. So just kind of in contrast, to conclude with the print that Henriette was speaking about, these are very different ways of seeing. These are very different modes of seeing, and seeing and sight takes on very different contexts in Northern and Southern Europe, depending on the religious climates of each. And so if I could just have the next slide, please, where we compare both of the images. We will now open it up to questions, and my colleague Tyga will be moderating.
Hi, it's good to see you all through the screen. My name is Tyga Ermansons, and I'm an educator at Smith College Museum of Art. And I'm really happy now to share your questions with Danielle and with Henriette for perhaps maybe 10 minutes if we have that time. And so if we don't get to your question, Lauren will be back to let you know how to resend it, and the curators will be happy to email you with replies. So the first question is, and perhaps it's for both of you, Henriette and Danielle, how do the different mediums of these two pieces affect how we as viewers see and experience them?
I'll start that off, and then Henriette, please jump in.
Sure.
Ready? As Henriette said, prints were often seen in albums. You can just tell, so detailed and really require a kind of intimate, close viewing. I mean, you pointed out the details, but I'm sure there are many more that we don't even have time to get into. Whereas, as I said, this painting in a public context, in a religious setting, was enormous, and you might have just had kind of more of a bodily relation to it because it's more on our scale. So I think it's an excellent question in terms of how we experience these two different media. One is much more kind of intimate, and one is very much more all-encompassing. But Henriette, please jump in.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. Also the way that prints just also were, a tactile thing. You can actually hold the paper, and it's a different experience in that regard as well. It's a very tactile experience. And also the fact that, paintings were made for specific people or for the church, and prints were really kind of made for everyone, and were a more democratic medium. And so in that way, they were also in a very different, people had a different relationship to them as well.
And so, Henriette, we may stay with you now because there are actually two questions that kind of take you back into the print. One is, what is the source for identifying the cat with Vanity?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I honestly, when this question came up, I just saw it in the Q&A. I had to think back. I think I found it in one of the books that I referenced on Bosch. I have not heard of the cat being specifically used for vanity as such, but more as a cat being kind of an evidence of human failing in some measure at the time. But, you know, symbols, these types of symbols will change and have, and certain objects can change in meaning as well, or have multiple meanings. I think it has more to do with human failing than it has to do with vanity. But that was the way it was interpreted in this wonderful book on Bosch, actually, that I read.
Well, maybe, and related to that as a follow-up, is that the small animal actually looks like a monkey to me.
Yeah.
Aren't they connected to sexuality?
Yes, yes. Monkeys definitely are connected to sensuality. I was looking at it very carefully. I think it is. It has the legs of a cat and not of a monkey. It's an odd looking cat, I have to agree. So, I mean, it's possible. I mean, sensuality is definitely could be referenced as well. But I still stick with the idea that I think it is actually a cat. But I could be. I could change my mind.
All right. And Henriette, I'm
Yeah.
sure Danielle will get to you in a moment, but can you say a bit more about the text at the bottom of the print? At least on the surface, it doesn't seem like a critique of vanity, but rather a celebration of beauty. What do you make of the text? Yeah,
well, it's a very tricky thing. And because, like I said, there is some kind of irony that is happening. There's a double entendre and a kind of a dual meaning. That's how I started to interpret this, because it's constantly kind of going back and forth between these two messages of the idea of vanity being a good thing, but also being a bad thing. I mean, obviously, an artist who's creating something beautiful, which is a kind of a copy of reality, that's a beautiful thing. However, there is the danger of it becoming more than reality, and I think it's constantly that questioning, that balance between, it being a virtue or a vice. And I think that's what I love about these prints, the fact that it's never straightforward. Let's put it that way.
And I think this one actually will relate to both of you, but the question is the use of color. Did the Catholic Church use colors to send their message out?
Sure, I'll start that off. Yes, I think color was extremely important in 17th century Southern European painting. In the first sense, color is an identifier. So usually Saint Peter, as we see him here, is dressed in blue and gold. So just on a purely basic level, we can often identify people, religious figures based on the colors they're wearing. And that's kind of a quick code for people to know who is being depicted. But certainly color, I think, especially in this de Bellis painting, is used in a way that unites the composition. So that blue really draws your eye to the most important protagonist, followed closely by the flash of white, this kind of visionary angel completely dressed in white. So I think color is used very deliberately to guide your eye around the painting. And as I said, help you with meditation, which is the function of a painting like this. And very kind of bright, saturated colors you'll often see in 17th century Catholic art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can say a little bit about color in prints. I mean, the fact is that some of these prints at the time were hand colored because people did like wanted to make them kind of more painting-like and give them a certain riches. And color, therefore, was, was provocative. And in the painting that I showed before that was done after the print, you can see these rich colors that have been chosen to kind of show this print. But the color, adding color to a print is always tricky because it can change its meaning somewhat. I mean, putting everything in red like we saw in the painting, all of a sudden the focus becomes more like a sensual experience. And while I think that was not the initial intent of the artist.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, were French printmakers also influenced by the use of emblems in Flemish art?
French printmakers were very much influenced by the Flemish. There were actually in Paris at the time a lot of Flemish printmakers that had their shop there. And that's what Abraham Bosch actually trained under a Flemish printmaker called Melchior Tavernier. And so yes, there was a heavy influence from the north. And emblems, which are these this idea of symbols that are used in a lot of these works, were heavily used in the north. And I think that's why a lot of these kind of influences came into France, and then also also went to Italy in some extent. But yes, definitely in France.
So maybe as our final question, and maybe again connects back to even the use of color or so, but in a mute art form, one might expect that sight would be privileged. Do you find that to be the case? Who wants to take that?
I think that's a very astute observation, actually. Yeah, I think sight is, as we said, is kind of hierarchically the first sense that people talk about, at least in the 17th century context. And in viewing art, it's the one we tend to rely on most. And as Henriette said, there are a lot of other senses that come into play, and we'll talk about that throughout the series, not just in 17th century Europe, but in other areas of the world and times. But I would say, yeah, they're appealing to our senses first and foremost through sight as a way to engage us and really kind of pull us in. Henriette, please.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that's definitely the case. Yeah.
While I said that would be our last question, I just want to address one other question that was there that we spoke of as the moderators a little before, but there was a question of how do we see colors? And I think perhaps leaving on this, it's such an excellent question as far as how do we see? And clearly that is a very large topic as far as, is vision coming through our, eye physiology, or is it from our brain? And so maybe we'll leave that to the person who asked it. We very much appreciate the question, but we will defer and keep it on the table through the rest of the session. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle and Henriette.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I would like to thank everyone for attending today's session. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to contact the SCMA members email, which is located on the bottom of your screen. We hope you can join us for our next session, the Five Senses Taste, which is on Thursday, July 23rd at 3 p.m. The link for this program will be sent to you tomorrow in your email, or you can also find it on our website. We hope to see you next time.